Welcome back to the Rotary Information Series. I'm Lynn Morgan, the host. If you're just joining us, Marcia Baum, Executive Director of Michigan Citizens for Stem Cell Research and Cures, introduced us to a Michigan family who are living the life with juvenile diabetes, a disease which currently has no known cure. In this half of the show, Marcia will be speaking with Dr. Jack Mosier. Jack is an assistant research scientist at the University of Michigan in the Life Sciences Institute about research he and his colleagues are doing in the search for cures. Marcia.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Shall we get right to our science lesson?
Let's do it.
Okay. Dr. Mosier, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you do at the University of Michigan?
So I'm a scientist at the University of Michigan Center for Stem Cell Biology in the Life Sciences Institute, and I study stem cells of the nervous system and how they form the nervous system, that network of cells that allows the brain to communicate with the body and vice versa. And not only am I interested in how stem cells lead to the formation of the nervous system, but how defects in the stem cells actually lead to diseases within the nervous system.
Dr. Mosier, it's my understanding that stem cell researchers conduct research using embryos that are regularly discarded from fertility clinics when they're no longer needed. But in Michigan, researchers are not allowed to work with these discarded embryos. What effect does this have on the study of embryonic stem cells and potential cures in Michigan?
That's right. The restrictions on the scientific use of embryos that would otherwise be discarded from fertility clinics have negatively impacted embryonic stem cell research here in Michigan. Embryonic stem cells are derived from fertilized eggs that are in excess of those needed for fertility treatments derived in reproductive technology clinics. And routinely in these clinics, both here in Michigan and throughout the country, embryos are discarded either because they're in excess of those needed for fertility treatments. The parents have already achieved the number of children they want and no longer want the excess embryos, or those embryos are insufficient for implantation because they may contain a genetic defect or be unhealthy in some way. And so in many states and in countries throughout the world, many parents have the option of donating those embryos for scientific research. But here in Michigan, current laws deny parents that choice. And in effect, the laws really don't save any embryos from destruction. Regardless of whether these embryos are used for potentially life-saving treatments and cures, they're going to be destroyed anyway. And so that effect is that it really impedes medical research, such that those embryos that would be otherwise discarded can be used by scientists here in Michigan to drive new lines of embryonic stem cells to help find cures and treatments for thousands of Americans.
Well, perhaps it would be a good time right now to talk a little bit about just what the basics are of that research. In other words, can you tell us a little bit? I've heard that there are adult stem cells, there are embryonic stem cells. Can you give us a little brief sort of like tutorial?
Sure, I'll try and be as brief as I can. So we should probably define stem cells first for those who aren't familiar with them. Basically, stem cells are unspecialized cells that have the ability to give rise to specialized cell types. And all stem cells share two important features. They can renew themselves and generate more stem cells, and they also have the ability to give rise to specialized cell types, as I just mentioned. However, despite these common traits among all stem cells, there are really big differences between adult and embryonic stem cells. So let's start with the adult stem cells. They're also called tissue-specific stem cells because they're found in specific tissues within adults. And adults in this case means newborns, children's, and full-blown adults. And these stem cells have the ability to give rise to specialized cell types, but they're more restricted compared to embryonic stem cells. For example, in the brain, there are stem cells, and these stem cells have the ability to give rise to more brain cells. In the blood, we know there are stem cells, and these cells have the ability to give rise to blood and immune cells. The umbilical cord blood, for example, has stem cells as well. But like other types of adult stem cells, these stem cells are restricted in their potential compared to embryonic stem cells. Unlike adult blood cells, can only give rise to blood cells and immune cells. And the ability of adult cells to renew themselves is limited and decreases with age, and in some cases, these cells completely go away. So in contrast, embryonic stem cells are found at the very earliest stages of development, harvested from a 4 to 5 day old embryo. Those embryos that are in excess of those needed or unsuitable for fertility treatments, and donated with the fully informed consent of the parents who no longer want them. No money is exchanged. It's completely voluntary. And the important difference, two of the important differences between adult and embryonic stem cells, and the reason that embryonic stem cells get so much attention and have so much potential, is because unlike the adult stem cells, they have an indefinite ability to renew themselves, to repopulate and give rise to more and more unspecialized stem cells. But they also, embryonic stem cells that is, have the ability to give rise to all the cell types in the body.
Really?
And so that's a particularly fascinating characteristic of these cells. And we've known about the adult stem cells for the last half century and have done a lot of research on them. But in contrast, the embryonic stem cells really we've only had for about the past decade. And so it's important for us as scientists really to go forward with our research with both types of these stem cells and try and find cures and treatments for diseases such as Gabriel's.
Well, thank you. I have been reading lately, and there's been some press about what some people are calling a new kind of stem cell that is supposed to take the place of an embryonic stem cell, so we wouldn't need embryonic stem cells to find cures. Can you tell me a little bit about what that is and if that's a fact?
Yes. So the type of cell you're talking about they're called induced pluripotent stem cells, abbreviated IPS for short. These cells are created when adult cells, such as skin cells, are reprogrammed to acquire the properties of embryonic stem cells. And they're done so without the destruction of embryos. And so this is where particularly opponents of embryonic stem cell research say, hey, wait a minute, you've got these cells that have the properties of embryonic stem cells, and you can acquire these without the destruction of embryos. Why not go forward with these cells as a substitute for embryonic stem cell research? But in fact, there are several potential very serious drawbacks with these IPS cells. For example, in order to reprogram them, that is to take them from an adult skin cell into a cell that now has the same property of an embryonic stem cell, we have to use viruses to introduce genes into these cells that changes their properties. And we know from previous research that the viruses that we're using make these cells more susceptible to cancer. And so as they are now, these cells could never be used in patients. But there are scientists out there now who are trying to find ways to reprogram these cells without viruses and without genes, and may in fact do so. But there are also scientists who believe that that's not possible. So whatever the outcome, the point is that the example of these cells and their potential drawbacks really illustrate the need that we have to go forward with all three types of stem cells, adult stem cells, embryonic stem cells, and these new IPS cells, to really have all the weapons at our disposal to find the best way to treat and cure diseases.
That's a lot to take up. Thank you for that explanation.